The armory smelled the way armories always smell: solvent and steel and the faint electrical burn of equipment that runs too hot in a building never designed for it. The overhead fluorescence threw flat light across the long workbenches, and 30 4A1 carbines stood barrel up in foam racks along the east wall. They had been cleaned, inspected, and cleared for deployment by the SARD-7 Diagnostic bench sitting in the center of the room. The unit had requisitioned it 14 months ago at $89,400, and Staff Sergeant Aaron Kessler had spent 3 weeks at Fort Lee learning to run it, and he had run it well that morning. All 30 rifles passed. The old man came through the side door at 10:30. He was 74 years old and carried a worn canvas tool roll under one arm, the kind that closed with a leather tie and had been rolled and unrolled so many times the canvas had gone soft as old flannel. His name was Earl Denton. He wore a gray flannel shirt, work pants, and boots that had been resoled more than once and were going to need it again. He walked to the near end of the workbench, set the tool roll down without opening it, and looked at the row of cleared rifles for a long moment before he looked at anything else in the room. If this story is hitting home for you, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've got a veteran in your family, share their branch in the comments. I read every one. Earl Denton had spent 26 years in the United States Army as a small arms repairman. The last 14 as the senior armorer for units that did work the Army did not put in press releases. He had enlisted in 1969 at 18, gone to Aberdeen for his MOS training, and arrived in the Mekong Delta in the spring of 1970 carrying a soldering iron, a set of gauges, and the early understanding that the difference between a rifle that fired and one that did not was sometimes the difference between a man who came home and a man who did not. He learned the M16 in conditions no classroom replicated: monsoon water pooled inside receivers, sand packed into gas tubes, carbon fouling that would have been considered unthinkable at any stateside range. He learned what the weapons manuals described, and he learned what they left out, which was more. He went from Vietnam to Germany to a cold fire base on the Korean DMZ, where the temperature dropped so far below zero that M14 bull carriers were seizing in their receivers by 0400 if the men had not been trained to cycle the actions by hand every 20 minutes through the night watch. He fixed rifles with parts he had machined from steel bar stock because the supply chain had not caught up with where they were. He stripped weapons in complete darkness because the situation required it. He wrote 2 pages of a field maintenance addendum to the M16, a one technical manual that the Army adopted without printing his name anywhere on it. He retired as a master sergeant in 1995, the decade after that he ran a gunsmithing shop behind his house in a small town in rural Virginia. In recent years, he had mostly stopped taking work except for pieces that interested him and veterans who came with weapons other people had given up on. He had not planned on being at this armory. His nephew was the company's supply sergeant, and 2 evenings ago the nephew had called and described the pre-deployment inspection in a way where something in his voice went slightly flat, the way voices do when a man is not saying out loud what he is thinking very clearly. And Earl had said he would come take a look. Staff Sergeant Kessler was 29 years old. He had a Fort Lee certificate, a proficiency rating in the SARD-7 system, and a record of 0 defective arms leaving his bench that he was not modest about. He was not a bad armorer. His training was real, and his attention to procedure was real, and he believed in the equipment because the equipment had never failed in front of him. The SARD-7 had cleared rifles before deployments to 3 different theaters, and nothing had come back with a fault the bench had missed. He watched the old man set the canvas roll on his bench and look at the cleared rifles, waited a polite moment, and said, "Can I help you with something?" Earl gave his name. He said he was Raymond's uncle, meaning the supply sergeant. He said he was an old armorer and asked if he might take a look at a few of the rifles before the lot shipped. Kessler's expression went through the thing expressions do when a man is deciding how polite to be. He glanced at the SARD-7. The machine was the size of a large drafting table, matte black, with a touchscreen interface and a cable array running to a calibration block at one end. It had cost what it cost because it could detect headspace variance, timing faults, trigger group wear, gas port erosion, extractor tension, and 15 other failure categories with a precision that human hands, however trained, could not reliably match. It had a printed certification from the Army's Program Executive Office for Small Arms. It had a support contract, a calibration log, and a tech rep who drove out twice a year from Richmond. Kessler said, "Sir, these rifles have all been through the SARD-7 this morning. Full diagnostic battery. They're clean." Earl nodded. He said he understood. He asked again if he could look. There were 2 junior soldiers in the room. A PFC named Daly who was logging serial numbers into a binder, and a specialist named Torres who was running the cable harness for the SARD-7 back to its storage cradle. Both had been watching the old man since he came in. Torres had noticed the canvas tool roll. It was not the kind that came from a catalog. Kessler said, "I appreciate it, sir, but these rifles are inspection complete. The SARD-7 is the current Army standard. If it passed them, they're good to go." Earl said, "I'm not suggesting they're not." Kessler said, "The system runs a 17-point diagnostic. It catches things hands miss." Earl said he knew. He had read about the system. Kessler waited. Earl did not move to leave. There was a quality to the old man's stillness that Daly would describe later as like watching a man stand next to a machine he had already figured out. Not dismissive, not hostile, certain in some way that Kessler, who was not a stupid man, had already registered and was working to explain away. Kessler held up the inspection log in a way that communicated something without stating it. He said, "The deployment window is 48 hours. These rifles are certified." Earl said, "I know. I won't take long." Kessler looked at the rifles and then at the SARD-7 and then said, "Fine," the way men say fine when they are confident the outcome will confirm what they already know. Earl untied the leather cord on the canvas roll and laid it open on the bench. The tools inside were not all Army standard armor kit. Some were the headspace gauges, the punch set, the torque tool. But there were other things too. A set of hand-ground picks with worn wooden handles. A custom extractor tension gauge shaped from tool steel by hand at some point in the past 30 years. A bore light with a cord that had been replaced twice. A felt-tipped marking pen. A small notebook with a broken spine repaired along the hinge with electrical tape. He picked up the first rifle. He did not run it through anything. He did not plug into anything. He turned it over in his hands the way a man handles an object whose weight and behavior he has known for a long time. He looked at the bolt carrier through the open ejection port. He pressed the trigger group forward and held it. He ran his thumb along the inside of the lower receiver and stopped and looked at the ceiling the way a man looks when he is reading something with his hands rather than his eyes. He set aside. He picked up the second rifle. Kessler watched from across the bench with his arms crossed. He was not hostile. He was the way men are when they are waiting for something to end that they know will not change anything. Earl worked through the first 6 rifles in 15 minutes. He handled each one the same way, deliberate, no wasted motion, no performance. Each time he found something, he made a small mark in the notebook. He did not hold anything up and explain. He wrote it down and moved to the next one. On the 7th rifle, he stopped longer than usual. He pulled the carrier group and tilted it under the bore light. He wrote 2 lines in the notebook this time. He set the rifle at the far end of the bench, separated from the others. Kessler said, "What are you finding?" Earl said, "I'll tell you when I'm through." Daly had stopped logging serial numbers. Torres had finished stowing the cable harness and had not left the room. Earl picked up the 8th rifle and worked the action 3 times before opening the notebook and adding to what was already there. He set it at the far end with the 7th. He picked up the 9th and worked it for less than 2 minutes before setting it with the others. Then the 10th. Then the 11th and 12th together, one after the other, both moved to the far end. The pile at the end of the bench was growing, and Kessler was watching it and not saying anything now. Earl worked through the rest in the same manner he had started. No speed, no announcement, no glances toward Kessler to read the room. When he set the 30th rifle back in its rack, he stood at the bench for a moment, read through the notebook from the first page to the last, and then looked up. 11 rifles sat at the far end of the bench, separated from the 29 that had stayed in the rack. Kessler looked at them. He looked at the SARD-7. He He said, "What are you telling me?" Earl said, "I'm telling you those 11 rifles have faults. Some of them are minor. 2 of them are not." Kessler said, "The SCRD-7 cleared all 30. Earl said he knew. Kessler's jaw tightened. He said, "What faults? Specifically?" Earl opened the notebook. He went through it without rushing. Rifles 1, 3, and 5 had extractor tension below the standard Earl had worked from for 30 years, a standard derived from watching extractor tension failures under field conditions the Army tolerance window was never calibrated to account for. The SARD-7 passed them because they sat inside the technical limit. They sat inside the technical limit the way a man stands at the edge of a roof. Correct on paper, know where you would want to be in a strong wind. Rifle 7 had a cam pin with a wear pattern on the back face that the diagnostic cycle did not assess. That omission was in the SARD-7's own documentation, page 41, if anyone had read past the certification summary. Kessler said nothing. Rifle 12 had a gas tube with a partial obstruction. Not enough to stop function in control conditions. Enough to cause a stoppage in sand or cold, or the combination of both, which was a fair description of where these rifles were going. Rifle 17 had a firing pin, retaining pin deformed along the rear lip in a way that would eventually walk the firing pin out of the carrier during sustained fire. Rifles 22 and 26 had trigger group faults, different from each other, both missed by the bench. The worst 2 were 9 and 19. Rifle 9 had a barrel with gas port erosion past the wear limit. Not far past it. It would function, and it would function reliably for a period of time the shooter would have no way to calculate. And then underheat, the timing would shift, and the rifle would begin a short cycle. That was the kind of fault that did not kill a man by failing immediately. It killed him by failing without warning after he had trusted it. Rifle 19 had a cracked bolt, not visible to the eye without magnification. A hairline running from the rear lug face in a direction that put the next significant firing cycle within range of propagating it far enough for a catastrophic failure. Earl had found it with a pick and a bore light and 30 years of knowing where to look in a place the machine did not. The SARD-7's diagnostic protocol did not assess bolt integrity beyond a standard headspace check. That was also in the documentation. Page 63. Kessler stood at the bench and looked at the 11 rifles for a long time. Torres had his arms at his sides. Daly had set down his coffee. Kessler said, very carefully, "Can you show me the bolt on 19? Earl handed him the bore light. Kessler took the bore light and crouched at the bench and held the bolt under the lens the way Earl showed him, at the angle with the light positioned just inside the rear lug face. He was there for about 4 seconds before he stood up. He did not say anything right away. He set the bore light down. He picked the bolt back up and looked at it again without the light, turning it slowly, as though hoping the crack would resolve itself into something else. A scratch, a shadow, a flaw in the finish that the light had exaggerated. It did not. The hairline ran from the rear lug face across the land between lugs in a direction that did not require an expert to read once you knew where to look. Kessler set the bolt down on the bench and looked at the SARD-7, and then looked at the 11 rifles at the end of the bench, and then looked at Earl. Earl was watching him without expression. Kessler said, "The bench doesn't run a bolt integrity check." Earl said, page 63. Kessler pulled the SARD-7 operator manual from the shelf above the bench. It was a thick spiral-bound document with a tabbed index and a cover that had been laminated against shop wear. He found page 63 and read it and did not look up from it for a long time. The paragraph was short. It described the bolt assessment protocol as a headspace and timing check only, and noted in a subordinate clause, in the same font size as everything else on the page, that visual and tactile inspection of bolt body integrity remained a recommended supplemental step at the armorer's discretion. Recommended. Supplemental. At the armorer's discretion. Kessler closed the manual. Torres was standing near the door with his arms straight at his sides. Daly had not moved from his chair, but he had put the serial number binder face down on the table in front of him, and he was looking at the 11 rifles the way a man looks at something he does not want to have to think about too hard. Kessler said, "If these rifles had shipped." He did not finish the sentence. Earl said, Two of them would have come back in a report. The room held that for a moment. Kessler pulled the inspection log from the bench and drew a line through the cleared status on the lot entry. He did it slowly with a black pen, pressing down. Then he picked up his radio and called the supply sergeant, and his voice was level when he did it, which said something about the kind of soldier he was underneath the morning he was having. Raymond, the supply sergeant and Earl's nephew, came through the door 2 minutes later and stopped when he saw the 11 rifles at the end of the bench. He looked at his uncle. Earl gave a small nod toward the notebook. Raymond picked it up and read through it standing at the bench, turning pages with care, and when he set it down, his face had gone the color of old concrete. He said, "I need to call the commander." Kessler said, "I already did. If you're with us this far, do the old man a favor and hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag a veteran in your life in the comments and let them know somebody still sees them." Captain Dana Merritt arrived from the battalion headquarters building in 11 minutes, which was faster than the walk normally allowed for. She was 31 years old, 2 deployments behind her, and she had the particular bearing of an officer who had learned early that competence in subordinates was something you recognized and used rather than threatened. She came through the armory door, looked at Kessler, looked at the 11 rifles, and said, "Walk me through it." Kessler walked her through it. He used a notebook, held it open to Earl's entries, and read each fault by rifle number in the same flat tone he had used on the radio. He did not minimize any of it. He did not make any remark about the SCRD-7 certification or its price or the 3 weeks he had spent at Fort Lee. He read the notebook and reported what it contained, and when he was done, he said that the rifles were being pulled from the deployment lot pending manual inspection of the full rack. Merritt said, "All 30. Kessler said, "All 30. Merritt looked at Earl. She said, "And you are?" Earl said his name and his rank, retired, and his MOS from the Army's old classification system, a number that meant small arms repairman, a designation that had changed names twice since he had carried it. Merritt said, "How long did this take you?" Earl said about 45 minutes. She looked at the SARD-7. She looked at the 11 rifles. She did not say anything about the $89,400, but the thought moved across her face for just a moment before her expression settled back into command. She said, "Sergeant Kessler, get the battalion master gunner down here." Chief Warrant Officer 3 Marcus Webb arrived 20 minutes later from the range complex on the far side of the post, still carrying the clipboard he had been using when the call reached him. He was 43 years old, 21 years in, and his hands were the hands of a man who had spent 2 decades inside weapons. Scarred at the knuckles, thick at the base of the thumb, with a particular roughness that comes from a lifetime of steel and solvent and work that does not stop because the weather is bad. He came through the door, and Kessler met him and gave him the summary in under 2 minutes. And then Webb walked to the bench and looked at the 11 rifles and looked at the notebook and then looked at the old man standing at the far end of the bench with the canvas tool roll still laid open in front of him. Webb said, "Who did the assessment?" Kessler gestured toward Earl. Webb walked over. He looked at the tool roll first, the way an armorer always looks at another armorer's tools before he looks at the man, because tools tell you what years of classroom instruction do not. He looked at the hand-ground extractor tension gauge. He picked it up and turned it over and looked at the ground face and set it down. He looked at the picks with their worn wooden handles. He looked at the bore light with its twice-replaced cord. Then he looked at Earl. He said, "Earl Denton." It was not a question. Earl said, "That's right." Webb said, "Master Sergeant Earl Denton, 72nd Maintenance Company, attached MACVSOG Advisory Element, 1971 to 1972. Author of the M16A1 Armorer Field Supplement, pages 44 and 45, the extractor tension addendum that every armorer school was using by 1978, even though they never printed your name on it." The room was very still. Earl said, "You've read it." Webb said, "Read it. I've taught from it. I've been teaching from it for 6 years, and I did not know until this moment that the man who wrote it was still alive." Kessler was standing to Webb's left and slightly behind him, and his face had gone through a sequence of expressions in the last 30 seconds that a camera might have caught, but that words do not easily reproduce. He had come into the morning confident in a machine that cost more than most people's annual salary, and he was leaving it standing in a room where a 74-year-old man with a canvas tool roll and a notebook with electrical tape on the spine had just found 11 faults in a certified lot, including a cracked bolt and a barrel past its erosion limit, in 45 minutes with his hands. Daly had pushed his chair back from the table without seeming to notice he had done it. Torres was standing at parade rest, also without seeming to notice. Merritt said, "Chief Webb, give me your assessment of the faults." Webb picked up the notebook and read it straight through without stopping. He set it down and said, "Accurate. All of it. The extractor tension calls are conservative against Army spec, but they're right for field conditions. The gas port call on Rifle 9 is correct and should have been caught. The bowl on 19 is correct and could have been catastrophic." He paused. "The SERD 7 runs what it runs. It doesn't run everything." Merritt said, "What do we do about the other 19? Webb said, "Manual inspection, all of them today. We use the standard from the notebook." He looked at Earl. "With your permission, Master Sergeant." Earl said that was fine. Webb turned to Kessler. His voice did not carry any heat in it, but it was direct. "The machine is a tool. You know that. You were taught that. The certification does not replace what hands know. You understand what I'm telling you." Kessler said, "Yes, Chief." Webb said, "Good. You're going to learn today. I need you at this bench." He turned back to Earl and said, "Sir, I'd like to ask you to stay, if you're willing. I want my soldiers to watch you work." Earl looked at the bench. He looked at the remaining rifles in the rack. He picked up the bore light and set it on the bench beside the notebook and said, "Let's get started." What followed over the next 4 hours was not a lesson in the way classrooms deliver lessons. Earl did not lecture. He did not explain ahead of what his hands were doing. He worked, and Webb worked beside him, and Kessler worked beside Webb, and Daly and Torres worked at the far end of the bench, and Earl answered questions when they came and left silences open when they didn't. He showed Kessler the extractor tension gauge and how it read at the narrower standard and why the narrower standard existed, tracing the logic back through a conversation about what happens to a rifle's timing in sustained fire under heat that he had first had in a maintenance bay outside Da Nang in the summer of 1971 with a sergeant who had been running M16S in the field for 2 years and had opinions about what the Army's tolerance window was missing. He showed Torres where to look along a barrel's gas port with a bore light to read erosion that a headspace check would not find. He showed Daly how to feel for the firing pin, retaining pin deformation on Rifle 17 without a gauge, running the young soldier's thumb along the lip the same way his own hand had found it, explaining that the sense memory would stay longer than any written description of it. Kessler asked him once, during a pause, how many rifles he had inspected in his career. Earl thought about it. He said he had no idea. He said he had stopped counting somewhere around the time he stopped thinking of it as counting. Kessler asked him how he had known to come in that morning. Earl was quiet for a moment. He said his nephew's voice on the phone had the sound of a man who was trusting something he had not yet had reason to distrust. He said that was usually the most dangerous position a soldier could be in. Kessler looked at the SARD-7 and then at the bench and then at the 11 rifles still separated at the end and did not say anything else. By 3 in the afternoon, the full rack of 30 had been manually inspected against Earl's standard. 3 more faults were found in the rifles the SARD-7 had also flagged as clean, 2 extractor tension calls, and 1 gas tube. Webb logged them all. The deployment lot now had 14 rifles pulled from it. 14 out of 30. Merritt came back into the armory at 3:15, and Webb gave her the final count, and she looked at it without saying anything for a moment, and then said, "Give me a corrected lot by end of week." She looked at Earl. She said, "Master Sergeant Denton, I'd like to ask you something, if you'll allow it." Earl said, "Go ahead." She said, "Is there anything in the SARD-7's protocol that is not fixable with a supplemental checklist?" Earl picked up the operator manual from the bench and opened it to page 63 and read the paragraph again. He said, "The machine does what it says it does. You need a supplemental visual and tactile inspection on every lot it clears. Written into the SOP, not optional, not at discretion." He set the manual down. "That's a 2-page addendum. I can write it before I leave if you have a yellow pad. Merritt said, I have a yellow pad. She sent Torres to get it. Torres set a yellow legal pad on the bench. Earl sat down, uncapped the felt-tipped pen from his tool roll, and wrote from memory, pausing once to check a tolerance figure against the gauge beside him. 31 minutes. He handed the 2 pages to Webb. Webb read them, standing, and passed them to Merritt without a word, because nothing needed to be said. Kessler asked if he could keep a copy. Earl told him to keep the original and wrote a second for the file. He shook Webb's hand, then Merritt's, then Kessler's last, holding it a moment longer than the others. He drove home on the same county road he had come on, windows down, October air cold enough to mean something, the canvas roll on the seat beside him worn to the shape of everything it had carried. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already on your screen. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join us. We tell these stories so the men who live them are never forgotten. See you in the next one.